Tonight we have a really packed agenda. It's been great to meet a couple of new people and see some old faces. We're going to do a little bit of level setting about the General Assembly, really just go over the committee structure, which is how we communicate in this first part of the session, basically with our lawmakers. And then we'll hear from Blair, who some of you know, and if you don't know her, you will probably love her as much as the rest of us do after you hear her. And then we'll get an update from Kendl Kobbervig from the Energy Burden Coalition, which is one of the partner organizations that we work with, as well as Climate Cabinet, that is Blair's organization. And then we'll just go over some working group activities, highlight some of the status of bills that we have called our priority bills, if that hasn't already been covered by our speakers, and then have a little time for discussion and hopefully adjourn in a timely manner at 8. So with that, I just, again, wanted to capture the Senate brick wall that is really the defense against all of the governors and the Republicans in the General Assembly, their attempts to undermine or repeal RGGI, the Virginia Clean Economy Act, the electric vehicle standards, clean car standards, and then the budget. So we will be circulating this deck, but you will have the links to the actual committees there. I've listed kind of the key Democratic lawmakers that we typically communicate with, because they are really the brick wall, as the Republicans typically vote en bloc. And then I've noted the meeting time for the committees, because that's when, if you go down to Richmond, or if you want to tune in and listen to a hearing or a committee meeting, or if you join us to testify at one of the committee or subcommittee meetings, these are the meeting times. So kind of, I like to go ahead and just block them out on my calendar. You know, as we go forward in the session, we would build this out to show House committees if needed. And then we do communicate more broadly with members of the General Assembly. But at least for at the initial stages, our focus is on these committees. So any questions on that? Comments? Okay. So with that, I am delighted to welcome Blair St.Leger-Olsen, who is joining us from the Climate Cabinet. She is a behavioral ecologist turned climate policy advocate, and she currently serves as a legislative director at Climate Cabinet. And I'm going to read her little blurb because it is just so impressive. After influential experience in both the nonprofit and private sectors, she leverages behavioral science techniques to build climate policy capacity and expertise in state legislatures and local governments across the country, and helps local leaders run, win, and legislate on the climate crisis. Blair received her Master's of Science degree from the University of Virginia in Environmental Sciences with a concentration in behavioral ecology, and her undergraduate degree is Environmental Studies with a minor in mathematics from Hollins University. So we're delighted to welcome you, Blair. And I think I'm going to hand over the screen to you. Is that right?
You can definitely take the lovely giant picture of my face down. And if you want to stop screen sharing, that's great. I want this to be a conversation, folks. So the same way I would treat a class while I was teaching, when I used to teach was, please stop me if I am talking too fast or if what I'm saying doesn't make sense, because if I've lost you, I've probably lost everyone. You're not alone. And this is some, heavy, complicated, sometimes depressing stuff. So thank you guys for having me. Like Amy said, my name is Blair St.Leger-Olsen. I'm actually from Northern Virginia, born and raised. I grew up in Great Falls. Several of you happen to know my mother, Judith St. Leger Rody. So I promise to say hi for everybody, and she says hi back. But now I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I spend a lot of time running around the country and running around Virginia, most importantly, trying to help advance climate policy. So Climate Cabinet, which has 3 arms, we have Climate Cabinet Education, which is our 501c3. We have Climate Cabinet Action, which is our C4. And then we have the Climate Slate, or the Climate Cabinet PAC, which is our 527. So through those, we help local leaders at the state and local level run, win, and legislate on climate. So the part that we're going to talk about today is that legislative part. So we're part of Virginia's Environmental Coalition, but we really do focus specifically on climate and clean energy and try to put everything that we do through an environmental justice framework. So as I talk today about what bills you can expect at the General Assembly, I just want to note that there might be other bills that I don't cover that are what you would consider more environmental or conservation focused. And for what it's worth, that doesn't mean that I don't think they're good bills. There's just only one of me in my organization, and so I have to prioritize. And we really do try to focus specifically on climate and clean energy. So we're going to talk about bills in sort of 3 buckets this evening. And when I say we're going to talk about bills, for what it's worth, we're going to talk really roughly about bills because we have no bill numbers for about 98% of all of this, which means I can tell you some things, but I can't tell you everything. And we'll hopefully have lots of bill numbers by, I'm going to guess Thursday, but don't have too much now. I'll flag that currently LIS for the House list starts in the 1300s and nothing before that. So there's a lot to come. It's been pre-filed. That's just waiting in the ether and giving me anxiety on a regular basis. So when those 1,000 bills drop just for the House side, then we'll have more to talk about. But the 3 buckets we're going to discuss today is, one bucket is defense, one bucket is offense, and then one bucket is a TBD. We're still evolving our opinion as to where we can be effective and how we can be effective. So I'm going to start with defense, which, for the record, the vibe of this conversation will be, I'm going to make you depressed, and then I'm going to make you happy, and then I'm going to level you out a little bit. And hopefully by the end, you'll be plateaued. And I wish I could say that that isn't what legislative work is like, but unfortunately these days, that's what legislative work is like. So it's a realistic expectation setting for this conversation. So let's dive into defense. We've got 3 main buckets of bills that the environmental community wants to defend against when it comes to climate and clean energy. And there's 2 sort of side asterisk bills that we're going to talk about at the end. But the big ones you guys know: the Virginia Clean Economy Act, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and the Clean Car Standards. Let's talk about the VCA first. So last year we had about 30 bills that were designed to kill these priorities, and about 10 of them were targeted at the VCA. When I say targeted at the VCA, I mean wipe it out completely, tinker with it some, opens the code and leaves it vulnerable. Those are kind of the descriptions we look at as we determine whether or not a bill goes on a list of, does this need to go away? I sometimes have more colorful language when I refer to that list, but I'm going to go with it needs to go away for the purposes of this conversation. And we anticipate seeing those same bills again this year, and they might get more creative. They might get, because we're in an election year, more focused on political messaging. And some of them might actually be helpful. And we have to have conversations with our friends who are lawmakers and say, hi, your intent is good, but you cannot open the code. We had a few of those instances last year, and folks within the Democratic Party were very open to having those conversations and really understood. We even had some Republicans, Senator Hanger, who turned his good bill into a Section 1 bill so as to not have it be opposed because it opened the code. So those are the conversations we're going to be having, and we'll look for things like straight repeals. Nick Freitas carried several of those last year. Would not surprise me in the slightest to see those again. We have a couple bills from Lee Ware percolating in the universe that hit upon what are called energy intensive and trade exposed industries. So basically the manufacturing community that uses a lot of energy, as well as sometimes use natural gas as a feedstock. They claim that they need relief from increased energy costs, and those increased energy costs are of course due to clean energy. So we're going to fight against some of those lovely bills. And then there's sneakier ones that open up the code and don't look like they can do anything, but if you look deeper, they start to redefine what renewable energy is. And we discovered one of those today. And so we've got a bill actually from Kilgore that just dropped that redefines renewable energy to include coal mine methane and opens up the VCEA. So that's a very small component of Virginia's electricity mix, but really wants to define it as renewable. So we're going to be looking at things like that seem super minor and super small, but are really a threat to the Virginia Clean Economy Act. And while we're on the Virginia Clean Economy Act, I'm going to talk about one of those nuanced bills that I said had sort of an asterisk on it. And it's something that actually I lead our coalition, our Virginia coalition, to defend against. And it's called a natural gas preemption bill. And it's passed in about 22 states over the last 3 years, thanks to our defense against it in 2022. Virginia had the least amount of Democratic support for this bill in national history. And for what it's worth, David Reed was the one Democrat to vote for it on the House. And it was a mistake, and he meant to gray sheet it. So no one get mad at him, because I asked him actually not to change his vote. And because of that, he got asked to be the Democrat on the conference committee for the bill, which ended up being an exceptionally useful power move for us to have clarity in a conference committee that normally that's a level of access that we do not have. So that bill's coming back. We've already heard from the manufacturers that they intend to drop it again. And basically what it does is it says localities cannot use zoning ordinances to promote building electrification, which really locks us into natural gas infrastructure, which is both bad for climate, bad for ratepayers, and if you've seen the news over the last 60 days, not safe, since we keep blowing up things by cutting natural gas lines. Bad all around, right? So we consider that bill to also be a threat against the VCEA, because any version of natural gas infrastructure that we lock ourselves into, whether or not it's for heating and cooling or it's for power generation, is not good for Virginia. And it also props up an industry that we need to move away from. So before I move on to Reggie and clean cars, does anybody have any questions about the attacks we anticipate on the VCEA?
Blair, did you have a bill number for the preemption bill, or was that just you? It's a confirmed rumor, essentially.
I know it's coming, but LIS is, LIS.
Okay. And did you know who the patrons would be of it by chance?
I'm going to guess Kilgore, but if I had to bet, Vassy is currently working to get Morrissey to be a Democratic Senate patron.
Interesting. Okay, that's good to know. Thank you.
This is my life. Interesting
Blair,
is the right word.
I have a question too on the VCA with the Dominion bill dropping soon. I'm sure there's going to be lots of ways that will undercut major provisions of the VCA, and pretty sneakily too. How are you guys going to really monitor that, and how are you going to guard against that in the very friendly Commerce and Labor Committee on the Senate side?
So we've got 3 buckets: defense, offense, and then that TBD bucket is where I'm going to talk about the Dominion bill, because it is absolutely an evolving entity, and one that we're going to have to be delicate about.
Hey,
Any,
Blair, I have a question. Could you share with the group, especially for our new folks, the risk of opening up the code and what you mean by that?
absolutely. So you basically have two different types of bills that can get introduced. It's either a bill that amends a specific code section. That's what I mean by opening up the bill, opening up the code. It says, I want to alter this code section and either insert this language or change this language. And our programs, the VCA, Clean Cars, and Reggie, those code sections, if we were to deliver a bill to Governor Youngkin, even if it was a good bill, let's say, which we did have some good bills about clean energy, for instance, last year, that on energy storage, for instance, the CRE deeds introduced SB 304, if memory serves. And while inherently it was a good piece of legislation, if a piece of code is opened up, the governor can make any amendments to that code section he wants to during reconvene. So if you want to have less of work and dumpster fireness come veto session, which we AKA reconvene, you don't deliver any code to the governor on a silver platter that he can weaponize. The clean energy community was really smart about this in 2022. An example where it got very, very bad for in the General Assembly, Irene Shin introduced a bill to ban discrimination based on headscarves, and the bill passed. However, the code section that it opened up, Governor Youngkin returned what's called an amendment as a substitute, and actually, for lack of time to be nuanced about this, basically approved discrimination for religious groups because he had that code section available to him. So, and it was a very large fight on the House floor during veto session. So hopefully other communities have looked at how that type of instance blows up when we have a governor who doesn't always have our best interests at heart with some of these things. And we won't see things like that again. And the way you avoid that is you do what's called a Section 1 bill, which doesn't open up the code and can still add additional instructions regarding how code sections are interpreted, but doesn't itself open it up and make it vulnerable to gubernatorial amendments. Monique, do you think that answers the question?
That was great. Thank you.
Awesome. And if I am talking in internal inside politics, baseball lingo that doesn't make sense, please stop me and I will gladly try to come back to words that make sense. Okay, so with that, we're going to dive into Reggie and clean cars. Let me do clean cars first because it's actually, even though there are more attacks, it is a little bit simpler. So the clean car standards, as I think most folks know here, we passed in 2021, HB 1965 that was carried by Delegate Bagby. Last year, it had about 3 bills, if memory serves, two on the House side, 1 on the Senate side, to repeal it or tinker with it, push it out. This year, we have 7 so far. It is very much becoming a political issue. So we have 7 straight repeal bills introduced, 5 on the Senate side. Coincidentally, of those 5, each of the senators is anticipating a primary. So not surprising, we're all trying to out-Republican one another. And then 2 on the House side as well. So those bills are going to be, in theory, easier to kill because they are very simple on the face of it. They are very clear about what they want to do. They want to roll back the biggest environmental policy that Virginia has passed in recent history. And it targets the largest source of pollution in Virginia. So it is absolutely the environmental community's top priority to defend the clean car standards. Now, with that being said, it won't be without its trials and tribulations to defend against this. It, in theory, is going to go through Senate Ag. We are working very hard to make sure all of our Democratic senators in Senate Ag are ready to go and feel confident in protecting that bill. Whether or not they protect that bill because they like it, or they protect the clean car standards because it's what's good for them, I don't care. That's not the hill I'm going to die on. Right now, we have a short session. We don't have a whole lot of time to influence people to a certain degree. Once session starts, it really does become I know you, you know me, we have a good relationship, please trust me on this one type of dynamic. So for the most part, we are feeling good about where all of these bills may lie. But for what it's worth, we need to keep delicate pressure on all of Senate Ag to make sure that everyone plays their part and does their job appropriately. And if we become concerned about how votes on Senate Ag can go down, there is a backup to say, how about we yank these bills over to Senate CNL? Because oddly enough, with one Democratic exception, Senate CNL has friendlier folks to the clean car standards than Senate Ag. So stay tuned. It will be a little bit of inside baseball, behind the scenes wheeling and dealing on these pieces of legislation. But nonetheless, all the important components and community engagement and grassroots work are still absolutely vital. And I know that all of the grassroots groups are continuing to create opportunities for everyone to weigh in and use their voice to support EVs in the Clean Cars program. Before we move on to Reggie, I'll say one thing. There is a bill, HB 1466, that's going to get amended because even though he's a lawyer, this is the messiest piece of legislation I think I've ever seen, and that includes the VCEA for what it's worth. Delegate Anderson has introduced a bill to ban child labor built electric vehicles in the Commonwealth. And he picked the wrong code section. He meant to pick the Clean Cars Code section, because what it says is if we can't prove that these vehicles are not being built with illegal child labor, that the Air Board has the right to rescind the Clean Cars program. There's a lot in that bill. For one, the state of Virginia does not regulate international child labor laws. Two, the state of Virginia does not regulate federal labor laws. We have no authority over child labor that happens outside of our state. Two, it uplifts anti-electric vehicle messaging. Three, I would very much like to ask Delegate Anderson whether or not he's using an iPhone that has Cobalt in it as he drafted this bill. So we know what this bill is. It is intended to open the code. Do we absolutely need transparent mining practices for all forms of technology, not just electric vehicles? Absolutely. Are there fantastic groups working on that for both national and international organizations? Absolutely. And some of them are VCN members if you're interested in talking to them. Does this bill actually have anything good in its heart? No. It is a political messaging piece, but it is a very creative way to try and attack the Clean Car standards, because if it were to pass with the Clean Cars Code, even if it is in theory well-intentioned, delivering the Clean Cars Code to the governor, like we discussed, is bad news bears and not something we want to do. All right, last but not least on defense, and I'll start moving a little bit faster, trying to talk slow because I've had a lot of Red Bull, but I want to pick up the pace a little bit. We have the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So there's a lot of different ways this program is being attacked right now. I'm not going to talk about the attacks happening at the executive branch level through the Air Board. I'm going to focus on the legislative paths. So there's two paths for the legislature to attack this program. One is with a straight bill, and one is within the budget. We have seen straight repeal bills drop, SB 1001 from Stewart, that dropped today. There are also governor amendments to repeal Reggie in the budget. And we might see what we refer to as an LS power bill. They try every year it's a power generator that really wants to be able to pass through their Reggie costs onto the consumers. So every year they introduce a bill to say, let us do this. And every year we say no, but we'll try again, most likely this year. So those are sort of the types of Reggie attacks that I'm anticipating, the ones in the budget for what it's worth scare me the most. And that's because of what our position will be during reconvene and what Democratic numbers will be versus what Republican numbers will be is very up in the air right now, with folks having to move to file for their new elections prior to reconvene, with clean energy and climate champions leaving the Virginia General Assembly and going to the halls of Washington to do fantastic work, but also making me sad that we're losing Jen McClellan. There's lots of shuffling. So the budget is a big concern for the community because we're not yet clear whether or not we will have the votes to defend against what's called predatory budget amendments come reconvene. The last bill I'm going to talk about defense-wise, and I'm just going to make a quick note to it, falls outside a little bit of this VCA Reggie and clean cars, but it's one that is along the lines of the preemption bill that the Heritage Foundation, ALEC, the natural gas folks is pushing, and it's what's called anti-ESG, or anti-woke investment, to block governments, particularly at the state level for state treasurers, for instance, from being able to divest, from being able to reward state grants to companies that aren't invested in fossil fuels. The layers upon layers are very dense, but it is something that is spreading across the country right now, and we want to make sure we see it before it shows up instead of after it shows up and it's too late to do anything about it. Okay, now that I've depressed everyone, we're going to uplift real quick, do a happy dance, because there are some good bills that are out there. I'm not going to lie to you about their odds, but there are some good bills out there, and even some of them that I do think will stand a chance at passing. We've got things like Senator Favola's renewable energy study for schools bill, which I know it's a study bill, but it's a start. We've got bills from Delegate Reed, for instance, that are seeking to help accelerate EV charging infrastructure in multi-unit dwellings. There's rural electrification bills coming from Reed and Sullivan and Senator Marsden. We anticipate an energy efficiency bill again. Senator McClellan is the lead patron. This is the bill that Senator Bell carried last year that the governor vetoed. They've made the tweaks that the governor didn't like, and hopefully that bill will sail through again. There's bills to uplift public transit. There's bills to adjust adjust and restore SCC authority. And we're even seeing the Energy Affordability Act, which Senator McClellan is one of the patrons on, that is evolving, but very excited to see how that can help support energy affordability and also hopefully be a counter argument and a counterweight to the Dominion bill we're going to talk about in a bit. And there's even a couple bills that are just helping local governments to install EV chargers. We had to pass a bill in 2020 to give the General Assembly the authorization to install EV chargers in their parking garage. Turns out, because we're a Dillon law state, we have to do that for localities too. So Senator Boysko is patroning a bill on the request of Loudoun County to give them that authority so that they can start installing EV infrastructure within their city government buildings as well. Those are all bright and shiny. I actually think a lot of those stand a pretty viable chance, depending in particular about how angry the builders get about some of these. We shall see. But the renewable energy bill is a study bill for schools. I think we'll see that probably go through depending on the fiscal impact. We anticipate the energy efficiency one to cruise through. A lot of the simple locality authorization should not give anybody any, wrinkles. And Terry Kilgore himself has been quoted in the media recently saying we need more rural electrification. So there's actually some pretty good legislation in the happy bucket that does really stand a chance, and it'll be great to see pieces of legislation that uplift positive messaging about clean energy be a focus and be something that we get to hopefully spend time on. So last but not least, that TBD bucket, the bills that Sharon brought up, I want to just flag, I am not a utility regulation expert. And I keep my organization out of utility regulation because we work in so many states. And again, there is one of me, and I have a few people under my team, but I'm not a lawyer, so I only play one on TV. So I may or may not be able to answer all of the questions, but there is a Dominion bill. It is not dropped. We have not seen the finalized copy. We have seen the version the lawyers really like, and there's also a version that the lawyers really don't like. So there's the version that digs into the code and skewers a lot of things, and then there is theoretically a softer version that still does some bad things, but doesn't open up the VCA code. And we don't know which one of those Dominion is going to go with yet. There are some not good things in the bill, adjusting how their ROEs are structured and taking some things out of racks and tinkering with how often we have an IRP process. There's some things that particularly concern me about saying the SCC can override the retirement dates that are structured within the VCA. That one's one of my biggest concerns. But right now the coalition is not panicking about this bill, because at the end of the day, if Terry Kilgore and Dick Saslaw join together to pass a piece of legislation, that bill is going through. So the best thing that we can do is work with those patrons and try to create a piece of legislation that is as good as possible, doesn't deliver the VCA in a silver platter, and work to help them understand why we want better energy affordability, which we're hopefully going to see from bills from Lee Ware, from bills from Jennifer McClellan. Oh goodness, yes, and thank you to what Kendall just put in the chat. Let me read it for the recording. The bill will tinker with how frequently rate reviews occur, also known as rate cases. I said IRP process because I'm currently digging into the North Carolina IRP. So don't mind me, all of the words get confused in my brain. Thank you, Kendall, I appreciate that. So the coalition is still figuring out what defense looks like, what level of defense will be appropriate, and how we can best be effective in making this piece of legislation as amenable as possible. And community outreach and grassroots pressure will absolutely be a very needed and effective tool once we figure out where our red lines are when we finally see the bill at hand. So Sharon, I don't know if that comes close to answering your questions. It's a very long bill.
Well, I guess my concern is if Dick Saslaw is involved, that makes me really anxious. And, you know, I could foresee opening up code provisions. I could really see a gutting of the VCEA through this process. So anyhow, just registering anxiety.
Saslaw is the intended Senate patron. The draft we have seen does open the code. And it is an evolving conversation, is really the best way I can, you know, before we flip to attack mode and get very deep into defend against this entire bill, we are trying to do as much as we can on the inside of things to soften it before really coming out hard in opposition, because we do recognize that if Saslaw and Kilgore are the two patrons, that really means we have to be smart about how we approach this. I want to read Renee's question. Okay, so the question is to the lawyers, which lawyers, like the ones that open up the code or doesn't open up the code? Dominion's lawyers, or just legal people who are legal experts in how legislation should be written in a clean and sophisticated way, far prefer a version that opens up the code and makes adjustments within the code directly. That is cleaner. That is much more, that is a much better way to write legislation. But like we talked about earlier, we don't like things that open up the code. So the advocates and the lawmakers, to a certain degree, because they are trying to anticipate what level of backlash this bill will create, are very open to talking about how we can avoid doing those things. And they do want to soften opposition to this. Dominion, to a certain extent, is not necessarily going after clean energy. They know that that Wall Street is looking at them, and they're under a considerable amount of pressure from the street to not attack clean energy. With that being said, I don't trust them. So we will be watching very, very carefully. Does anybody have any questions before we move on? All right, well, thank you guys so much for having me. I will stick around in case anyone has any other questions, but I think Kendl has some pretty awesome announcements, and I think Amy's going to introduce her. So I'm going to be quiet now and hang out in the background.
Well, first, thanks so much, Blair. So much great information packed into a short period of time. I do have one question. Can you just kind of confirm that our idea of focusing on the Senate brick wall with our grassroots efforts is where we should be focused over the next couple of weeks?
Absolutely. I think that is the best place that we have to exert influence at this juncture. With that being said, I know that the House is a little sensitive to being kind of abandoned because
Yeah,
they've been a little abandoned because they can't stop things from getting through at this juncture. But it's still absolutely incredibly important to make sure that all of our champions on the House side vote accordingly, to make sure to send the appropriate message to the Senate side that this is where their party and their coalition's priorities lie. So yes, absolutely, I highly encourage to focus the most lift on the Senate side of things, but to the extent that action alerts, quick emails, mass emails can still be sent to Democrats in the House to make sure that they're delivering the right message, that this is where the blue wall needs to come into play. I think that's still a very important role that we can't lose sight of.
Great. Thank you so much. Oh, I think you got one more question here.
So the question is, why did Climate Cabinet endorse Senator McPike for Senate District 29 when he's being primaried by Elizabeth Guzman, one of our favorites? Pretty sure this is a 501c3 webinar, so I'm not going to divulge too much or dive in too much, but Senator McPike has been a huge climate and clean energy champion, whether or not he takes a lot of credit for it, including doing things like rolling back fossil fuel incentives in Virginia, helping eradicate and move towards eradicating lead pipes in schools from the environmental justice perspective. With absolute respect to the work that Delegate Guzman has been doing, it was a decision that my organization made that we really, really respect the thoughtfulness of the legislation that Jeremy McPike has brought forward. We really appreciate his leadership position within the Senate caucus, and we really appreciate his dedication towards local government and building codes, which is an environmental issue that often gets overlooked. The importance of building codes and building electrification. These aren't sexy things, but they are things that make a very, very big difference within the environmental movement and our ability to tackle fossil fuels and hopefully electrify our building infrastructure. So they both applied. Everyone is welcome to apply. My organization picked Senator McPike, and I can say personally that that is a position that I agree with, but that in no way means that I don't think Delegate Guzman is still a good lawmaker, and wish her nothing but the best as she continues her political journey.
Yeah. I'll add that I think it was Senator McPike that arranged the hearing of the Joint Commission on Regulation.
Yes, it was
recently.
The JCAR hearing.
The JCAR hearing, which looked at the whole process of sort of putting Reggie on its ear through the regulatory process. So that I think that was a clever move within the caucus, and it's a joint commission of both houses. So
and actually JCAR has regulatory authority to slow those regulations. Yeah. And so that's one of the moves that he did behind the scenes that not many folks actually know was specifically his doing. Senator Deeds, love him, is getting all of the credit for that, but actually that work to help defend against Reggie attacks came directly from Senator McPike. So it's not shiny. He doesn't often take credit for the work that he does, but we really appreciate that. And So that's why we're going to continue to support him and support the Senate caucus as we look into 2023.
Thanks, Blair. And I'm going to hand it over to Sharon to introduce Kendl, just briefly, and I'll put up Kendl's picture here.
Here we go, another cute picture of one of our speakers. I'm so pleased to be able to introduce Kendl Kobbervig. She is the advocacy and organizing manager for Clean Virginia, and I have to say she's done a superb job since she's shown up with that group. But she's been in this game for a while now, because prior to that, she spearheaded other successful energy policy reform and environmental justice efforts, including coordinating big environmental protection campaigns for Tennessee conservation voters and co-founding a coalition that was dedicated to transitioning the University of Wisconsin at Madison to 100% clean energy. She's done a lot, but one interesting tidbit about Kendl is in her spare time, she's also a volunteer firefighter. So it's my pleasure to introduce you, Kendl.
Oh my goodness, I didn't know I was going to get a bio or an intro. Muted, but when you put my picture up, I just said, oh no. Amy, do I have permission to share my screen? Because I have just a couple slides. I think it'd probably be better just to stay organized. Okay.
You should.
Oh, it does say host disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, let's see. Here we go.
Possibly make me a co-host. And I'll be fast because I know it's
There you go.
7:40.
You should have it.
Okay. There we go. Perfect. Okay, cool. Can folks give me a thumbs up if they can see the slides on my screen? Yay. Okay, cool. All right. I have a knack for talking quickly, but I will try to enunciate and speak very clearly. So I'll get through a lot of good information in a short amount of time. So tonight I'm here on behalf of the Energy Burden Coalition, which is a pretty diverse and large coalition of organizations who do all different kinds of work, but have really coalesced together around this mission of ensuring that the transition to clean energy in Virginia is affordable, it's equitable, and that it prioritizes the interests of energy users rather than of utilities or special interests. So just to provide a little bit of background information, what is the energy burden? Folks may have heard of the term rent burden before. That's when a household pays more than 30% of their income on rent. The energy burden is the equivalent of that, but it is if a household or an individual pays more than 6% of their income on their monthly electric or utility bills or electric utility bills. So Virginians actually pay some of the highest electric bills in the country. We've seen this number waver a little bit. Like a year or two ago, we were the 6th highest. We were the 7th highest for a little bit. Right now, we're the 13th highest. And honestly, I think it's just because energy bills are going up everywhere right now because of the rising costs of fossil fuels. But basically, we always hang out in the top 15 highest states or highest costs in the country. This is kind of a really timely issue as well, especially with all the very weird weather we've been seeing, the Arctic fronts, the storms. It's been predicted that home heating costs this winter will rise by almost 20%. We'll actually be seeing some of the highest energy costs in more than a decade this winter in Virginia. And then, of course, you have to talk about the equity component of this, like who is experiencing the energy burden. And it is low income, it is Black and brown communities, it is folks who experience disability, who are on fixed incomes, who are hit the hardest by this issue. So that's just to provide a little bit of context on what the energy burden is. But the good news is I'm here to talk about a bill that will go a long way towards starting to solve this issue of why our energy bills are so high. Blair actually mentioned it. Thank you, Blair. It's the Affordable Energy Act. It is a bipartisan bill, but on the House side, we've got Delegate Rip Sullivan, and on the Senate side, we've got Senator McClellan, which to me is just really symbolic because as the original patrons of the Virginia Clean Economy Act, it's so cool to bring this really dynamic duo back together to say, hey, you know what? We passed this incredible landmark clean energy bill. The next step is making sure it's affordable and that it's fair for people. So that is really what this bill is designed to do. It is focused on restoring the ability of our regulatory agency called the State Corporation Commission, or the SEC, to lower electric utility rates when utilities overcharge. And what I mean by overcharge is charging customers above their authorized profit level. Blair actually mentioned this too, the ROE, the return on equity, which is something Dominion's going to try to raise this year. That's technically what utilities are supposed to make in profits. But what we've seen is that every year they typically get away with about $100 to $400 million on top of that profit level. So since 2009, we've seen Dominion has overcharged customers by around $1.9 billion in overcharges. So that money should be in Virginians' pockets, but because of decades of utility-backed legislation and their, really strong influence in the legislature, we've seen that regulators have basically been restricted from lowering rates to prevent those overcharges. So what this bill does is it returns that authority to the SEC so that when the next rate case comes around, this year it'll be Appalachian Power's rate case, and next year it'll be Dominion's. The regulators will actually have the power to reduce rates so that those overcharges are not happening. So that's the Affordable Energy Act. I did just want to quickly touch on 3 other priorities of the Energy Burden Coalition. Blair mentioned RACs as well, rate adjustment clauses. I wish I could go into those, but they're very complicated. I will tell you they're essentially like excess surcharges on our bills. That's a pretty broken way of recovering costs. And this bill, which is being patroned by Delegate Wilt and Delegate Suha Subramaniam, will essentially reform the way that the SEC is able to control those costs, which will benefit the ratepayer. We also are working with Delegate Shin, who has been an incredible champion protecting vulnerable Virginians against utility shutoffs. It's actually, this goes beyond just electricity. This covers gas and water as well during extreme weather and periods of crisis. So COVID, for example, anything related to climate disasters, this ensures that Virginians, especially Virginians who are, maybe rely on medical equipment and electricity just to stay alive, that they're not having their power shut off in those times of crisis. And then the last one is a bill being patroned by Senator Surville, who to lower the minimum bill for community solar programs in Dominion territory. Right now, unfortunately, the minimum bill to participate in those programs is $55 a month. It's one of the highest in the country, and it's very prohibitive for a lot of families to access shared solar, which is a really key part of climate action and mitigation. So Senator Surville's bill will lower that to around $20 a month, which puts us much more in line with peer programs in other states. I did also just want to quickly touch on the feasibility question, because I think we've all been hearing a lot that this session is nothing's going to get done. But I think energy affordability is actually a really interesting space to be working in right now because it's so bipartisan and because it's an election year. We want these votes to happen so that we get legislators on the record about how they're treating energy costs, rising energy costs, right? So votes equal accountability. We've seen increased media coverage of rising energy costs, like more and more articles, national news outlets are covering the kind of skyrocketing bills we're seeing. We have a really awesome and dedicated team of bipartisan legislative patrons who have taken these issues and really made them their own. And then this is something that's really kind of silly. This shouldn't matter, but it does, which is that the Affordable Energy Act is actually just about half a page, and Dominion's bill, as far as we can tell, there's one version that was like 28 pages. So when it comes down to choose between rate reform bills, I think we have a little bit of an advantage when our bill is just half a page and it's very easy to understand and simple. And then I know Governor Youngkin is nobody's favorite person, but I do think it would be remiss not to mention that his energy plan released back in October actually does explicitly mention the issue of RACs and overcharges. And he has said on the record that he would sign Senator Surville's shared solar bill if it reaches his desk. So we've basically got signs from the administration that these issues could potentially be very bipartisan. So my call to action for everybody is to attend the Energy Burden Coalition's Day of Action for Affordable Energy, which will be on Thursday, January 26th. It'll be in the Truist Building in Richmond. And we're right in the process of setting up legislator meetings, so it's actually not too late to register. We'll be providing breakfast and lunch. And I'm going to go ahead and drop the registration link in the chat. And that is it. I'm sorry, that was a lot of information, and I'm sorry that it's 7:55, Amy, but I will pass it back to you.
No worries at all, Kendl. That was amazing. That was really great information in such a short amount of time. And we are hoping that others will join us at the Day of Action. A couple of us have already signed up, and I think Meredith has created a Google form so that people on this call and others in our coalition can indicate if they're interested in going and, you know, connecting for transportation or whatever. So is there a deadline that you're?
No, actually, we're really lucky to have a former legislative aide on our staff who's able to text all of the other LAs. So even if somebody signed up like 12 hours before the event, we could get her to help us schedule an appointment with folks legislators. So there really isn't a deadline other than food. If you have a food request, let me know.
Okay. We know you're good for that. Okay, great. Okay, well, let's go back to our agenda here. And I just want to share these briefly. So this afternoon, after I had gone and found out, and Meredith had been tracking what bills had dropped, we started creating our new spreadsheet that we track legislation on. And so this is in the packet that you'll get. It has a very brief description of what a bill does, who the sponsor or committee is, and stuff to watch out for in the horizon if you're interested. As those of you who have participated in our group before know, you will be getting emails in the Google group with calls to action through a link on the Virginia Grassroots Coalition website typically. And unlike some other groups, our calls to action often go to every member of a committee rather than just your own legislator. And what we started hearing today is that some of the Action Network emails have been reprogrammed so that folks are, Meredith, who did yours go to? Not your current legislator.
Yes, I updated them with new district numbers, which aren't typically close to our existing district numbers. And so they're reworking that over at Action Network. So we've paused our Action Network activity for a little bit.
Yeah. Anyway, that's basically how we roll. So this is the one that we propose to the bills that we're proposing to support as of now. And you see some of the bills that Blair and Kendl mentioned, the Electric Utility Regulation Act that Kendl just discussed, and this rate adjustment clause reform. Those are both bipartisan bills, so we like to support those. The study on solar bills, and in the past we have included this bill that restricts Dominion and other regulated utilities from making campaign contributions because of their overwhelming power in the legislature. That's something we may come back to the group to see if we want to keep that in our bills to support. And as Blair mentioned, there may be some other good bills to support. We're just kind of in a holding mode right now. And then here's our defensive plays. And as Blair laid out, there are a ton of bills already on the clean car standards. But again, the basic structure is the same. So I think all the bills that Blair mentioned are already on here. So that's a good check, right? We're on top of it. But we'll keep building these out. And if people in the group have suggestions about things that we should put on here or take off, or other comments, please, keep us posted on your thoughts about these. And so now I think I'm going to pass it over to Monique.
Sure, I'll be super quick. This is sort of where you come in. We really encourage you to attend lobby days, and if you could pick one, I'm a little biased, but I do think that Kendl has put together a really strong and very efficient morning for you on January 26th. They're also doing training the evening before, so you kind of go in prepared, and you'll have materials there. We'll be calling on you at key points during session to have meetings with legislators, or make calls or send in letters. Look for our call to actions. We don't have an active call to action right this moment. We did have a pre-session one. We did have 23 letters submitted to legislators. Well, I guess 23 people, so it could have been multiples for both their Senate and delegate representatives, to just sort of pre-session level set, indicate support and defense of clean energy policy that's in place. And then the other thing that you can help us with, excuse me, is recruiting volunteers, and you'll see links in our email to not only map yourself so we know where you're located, but also to encourage others to join our group, participate in our meetings, and map themselves so that we can make sure we have representatives across the state that we can call on during this very short session. And then for those of you active on social media, you can watch our posts at Climate Work. Actually, is it at Climate Working? Meredith is putting it in the chat. And then also, when we talked about meetings, I should have also mentioned that at times we may have opportunities to actually testify before committees and subcommittees. So as those hearing opportunities come up, we'll reach out to you about that. And then also letters to the editor, which there are actually some groups that are going to be doing some letter to the editor action evenings, and we may tag on to that, and we can participate that way. Back to you, Amy.
Great, thanks, Monique. Any questions or other ideas from the group? Okay. Meredith, I think you were going to highlight a couple of the additional.
Yes, so the money out folks got a pack day on Tuesday the 24th, and I put in the email that reaches Nancy Morgan's group. So if you were able to go down on Tuesday, and then we thought it would be helpful if we knew amongst ourselves who would be going from Northern Virginia, and the form that I've put in the chat again just asks for your interest, whether you've already registered, if you can offer a ride, if you're interested in looking for a ride.